Welcome to the first content lecture for LPS 31, an introduction to inductive logic. Today we're going to be discussing two main questions. First, what is logic? And the second, what's the difference between deductive and inductive logic, since this is a course on inductive logic. There's a number of different ways that we could define logic. The one that's going to be the most useful for our purposes in this course is to think of logic as the science of reasoning. Or we could put it a bit differently and say logic is the study of proper argumentation. This, of course, invites the question, what is argumentation? What are arguments? And how does logic go about assessing them for propriety? So again, argument is a term that also has a number of different meanings in common English usage. The one that's going to be the most relevant for us in this course is to view an argument as a sequence of statements consisting of premises and a conclusion. Now, the conclusion states the point that's being argued for, and the premises state reasons that are intended to support that conclusion. So let's look at an example. So here's an example of an argument for the conclusion that Fido is a dog. So someone might give a series of statements like this. Fido is either a dog or a cat. Fido is not a cat. Thus, Fido is a dog. We often see terms like thus, or therefore, or so, used to indicate the presence of the argument's conclusion. And the statements that are intended to support that conclusion or to offer us some sort of reason to believe that conclusion are the premises of the argument. So this is an argument because it's a sequence of statements, two of which are intended to support the third. And we often will formally separate the premises from the conclusion of an argument by drawing a line between the statements that count as premises and the statement that we're designating as the conclusion. Here's another example. Premise: Tokyo is a city in Japan. Conclusion: thus Fido is a dog. Now this shows, right, that arguments can be bad arguments, right? Tokyo is indeed a city in Japan, but that doesn't really support the idea that Fido is a dog, right? So this shows that arguments are cheap. You can always offer statements to support a further statement, but some of them will be good and some of them will be bad. And the goal of logic is to help us distinguish good arguments from bad arguments. Now, there are two ways in which an argument can be bad. First, it might have false or implausible premises. And second, most important for us, it might have a weak inference. That is, the premises, regardless of whether they're true or not, might not really support the conclusion that they're intended to support. And it's that second aspect of the arguments that logic focuses on. Logic focuses on assessing the strength of inferences, where an inference is the move from a set of premises to a conclusion. So let's look back at our example. Fido is either a dog or a cat. Second statement, Fido is not a cat. Conclusion, Fido is a dog. In this argument, it could go wrong in two ways, right? It might be that the two statements, 1 and 2, don't actually support the third statement, or it might be that either one of those statements, 1 or 2, is not a plausible or true statement. In this case, we know that the two premises, 1 and 2, do in fact support the conclusion, right? If it's really the case that Fido is either a dog or cat, and we really know that Fido is not a cat, then we can conclude that Fido is a dog. If we look at this second example of an argument, Tokyo is a city in Japan, thus Fido is a dog. The first premise is indeed true, right? Tokyo is a city in Japan, but it doesn't support the conclusion. So this is not a good argument, not because its premises aren't true, but because they don't support the conclusion. Whereas in this Fido argument, the premises really do support the conclusion. Now, they might not be false. Maybe Fido is actually a dog, in which case the second premise would be a false premise. But assuming the premises to be true, they really do support the conclusion. All right, now let's say a little bit about what the difference is between deductive logic and inductive logic, since in this course we're going to be focused on inductive logic. Now these two branches, deductive logic and inductive logic, are both studied in courses here at UC Irvine. This course, as we said, is going to deal with inductive logic. The course that precedes this, LPS 30, is a course on deductive logic. Now the difference between these two branches is with respect to the standards they apply when assessing the quality of an argument's inference. Deductive logic assesses arguments according to their validity. So it's going to look at and judge arguments as being good or bad according to whether or not they're valid. Now what does it mean for an argument to be valid? When an argument is valid, just in case the truth of its premises guarantees the truth of its conclusion. Now, we're going to have a video later on that'll go a little more in depth in this notion of validity. But the basic notion we should be able to see from this example with Fido, right? We have two premises. Fido is either a dog or a cat. Fido is not a cat. And then we conclude Fido is a dog. This argument is valid because if the premises are true, the conclusion also has to be true. The truth of the premises guarantees the truth of the conclusion, if you will. Right? So if Fido really is either a dog or a cat, and he's not a cat, then we have to conclude that he's a dog. Right? Logic forces that on us. If we accept 1 and 2, we got to accept 3. Right? So this is a valid argument. And deductive logic is in the business of figuring out when arguments are valid or invalid. Let's look at another example. All ogres are green. Shrek is an ogre. Thus, Shrek is green. This again is a valid argument. If it's really the case that all ogres are green, every ogre is green, and Shrek is an ogre, then Shrek's got to be green too. Now here's that example of that invalid argument. Tokyo is a city in Japan. Thus, Fido is a dog. This is invalid because the premise might very well be true. In fact, it is. Tokyo is a city in Japan. But it has nothing to do with Fido being a dog. Fido might very well fail to be a dog. He might be a cat or something. While Tokyo is still a city in Japan. So good deductive arguments have the following two features. They have true or well-supported premises, as we said, and they're valid. Right? The truth of their premises guarantees the truth of their conclusion. So that's the standard for deductive arguments, validity. Deductive arguments are most common in deductive logic, in mathematics, in certain areas of philosophy. This is the sort of standard that we have for good arguments, as being valid and having true or well-supported premises. Inductive logic, by contrast, assesses arguments according to their inductive strength. Now we said an argument is inductively strong just to the extent that the truth of its premises renders the truth of its conclusion probable. So if the premises are true, the conclusion isn't necessarily true, but it's probably true. Right? So here's an example of a fairly good inductive argument. So it has two premises to it. First, more than 95% of Pittsburghers, that's people from the city of Pittsburgh, are Steelers fans, fans of the local football team. Premise 2, Jane is a Pittsburgher. Conclusion, Jane is a Steelers fan. Now this argument is not deductively valid, right? It could be true that more than 95% of Pittsburghers are Steelers fans, and that Jane is a Pittsburgher, and yet fail to be true that Jane is a Steelers fan, because she might be part of the 2 or 3 or however many percent of Pittsburghers who are not Steelers fans, right? So the premises might be true here, even if the conclusion, the conclusion might be false here, even when the premises are true. So it's not a deductively valid argument. So if we use the standards of deductive logic, we would have to say this is a bad argument. And yet, it's not a terrible argument, right? The premises here really do give us some reason to believe the conclusion, right? This is what we'd call an inductively strong, though deductively invalid, argument. So good inductive arguments have the following features. They have true or well-supported premises, and they're inductively strong. They have a high degree of inductive strength. Note here a key difference between validity and inductive strength. Validity is a binary notion. An argument is either valid or it's invalid, and that's all there is to it. Inductive strength comes in degrees, right? If we go back to this argument, if the first premise, instead of having said more than 95% of Pittsburghers are Steelers fans, if it had said more than 99% of Pittsburghers are Steelers fans, we would still have an inductively strong argument, and in fact, it would be an even more inductively strong argument than this one here. So inductive strength comes in degrees. Some arguments are more inductively strong than others. We can sort of see this, the relationship between deductive validity and inductive strength, through this nice picture that's in the Skirms text. So here we have arguments ranked from most strong to least strong, or totally worthless arguments. Right? Strongest arguments would be deductively valid arguments, arguments in which the truth of the premises guarantees the truth of the conclusion. Right? That's sort of a limit case of inductive strength. Right? Those are the strongest arguments. And as you go down, you get different degrees of inductive strength. Right? Maybe this is this is where that 99% of Pittsburghers or Steelers fans argument would fall, and then here's where that 95% one would fall, and so on. And then when you get all the way down here, you just have worthless arguments, like maybe the Tokyo is a city in Japan, therefore Fido is a dog argument. Pretty worthless argument, neither inductively strong nor deductively valid. All right, that concludes this first video on the difference between deductive and inductive logic. In the next video, we're going to unpack deductive logic a little bit more in preparation for some topics that we'll later discuss regarding inductive logic. And to do that, we'll ask questions about what statements are. Right? All these arguments are composed of statements. We're going to think a little bit about what statements are, and we're going to look at a type of logic that's known as propositional logic. So please tune into that video next. But before you do so, complete the participation poll for this video.